Good morning, everyone, and thank you for logging on this morning. MEEC members, please join me as we welcome Barry Dunn. Thank you, Barry Dunn, for presenting this morning. I'm Pat Collins, the MEEC coordinator. Today's topic will be building an IS maturity model, and the contract that supports this is IT security services and solutions. Your host will be Joe Traino, Senior Manager, and presenting will be Tina Bode, who is the manager. Joe will introduce Tina.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And what we're going to do is share. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment, but I wanted to thank Pat and Tamara for the opportunity to present to you today. So Tina Bode and myself, Joe Traino, will be presenting the webinar, Building an IS Maturity Model. And let me share my screen. And Tina, let me know if that's correct.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So Tina and I will be presenting some slides with you today. We also have a few polling questions that we want to ask throughout the presentation. Just for some housekeeping items, we want this to be interactive as possible. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those questions in the chat, or just just ask the question, raise your hand. Some of you were on video just a few minutes ago, but certainly we want this to be as interactive as possible as we go through this important topic. It is being recorded, as Pat mentioned, so it will be available for you to review and share at a later time. And so we'll have that information posted up on the MEEC website. Because we're a small group, Tina and I would like to just ask everyone to do a brief introduction. If you can let us know your name and what institution you're with and what your role is, just so we have some context of who the group is that we're with today, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'll just ask each of you to unmute and just mention the institution you're with and your role. We'll start with Pat. We know you're with MEEC, so I'll skip to Tamara, who's also with MEEC, and then we have Yin. Yin, if you could just say hi and let us know what institution you're with, that would be wonderful.
Hi, and I'm with Hartford Community College.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Rob Smith, how are you? It's good to see you.
Doing well. Good to see you, Joe. I'm Rob Smith from Goucher College, and I manage the college's administrative systems.
Good to see you. Nell?
Hi, I'm Nell Feldman. I'm the IT security manager at Montgomery College.
Thank you for joining us, Nell. Robert?
Hi, yeah, Rob Johnson. I'm a network administrator with Allegheny County Public Schools in Cumberland, Maryland.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. So I think that's everyone for this morning's webinar. So let's get started. So our agenda for the webinar today, we'll do a brief introduction of Barry Dunn and Tina and myself. We'll move into IT assessments versus maturity models. Really want to begin giving you an understanding of the differences between the two and the benefits. Then we will move into leveraging a maturity model, how you would leverage that. And next, the framework that you can utilize in a maturity model. We would move into meaningful actions from results of using a maturity model. And then finally, we'll have some time for questions. So a brief introduction to Barry Dunn and Tina and myself that are with you today. Barry Dunn is a national consulting firm, and we've been in business for close to 50 years and have been providing advisory services for close to 30. Our management and information technology group provides services to higher education clients, including risk assessments, HIPAA, NIST, and GLBA compliance assessments policy and program development, and training. We have worked with more than 145 colleges, universities, and systems, including libraries. We're independent and objective and have no affiliation with hardware or software vendors. I think that's important to point out. My name is Joe Traino, and I'm one of our managers in our Management Information Technology group. I have over 30 years experience as a technologist, CIO, and consultant, and I focus exclusively on helping higher education clients advance their programs. I have Maryland roots and have worked for a number of member institutions over the years. Tina?
My name is Tina Bode. I'm also a manager in our higher education technology practice area. My 12 years of experience have been focusing on compliance and risk management, specifically in information security controls. Nice to see you all today.
Great, thank you.
So we want to talk a little bit about why an information security program is important. We all know that understanding and implementing security controls is a vital part of risk mitigation for your institution. But the adoption of a program for information security has many benefits. A program provides a comprehensive framework and a systematic methodology to really help to mature and drive practices and your information security initiatives. It contributes the structure and, more importantly, sustainability, so you can continue to serve the information security needs of your institution. A program will also help to inform those priorities and to shape what initiatives are needed to really protect your environment and your data. And I think one of the most valuable benefits of adoption of a program is it really allows you to measure progress of your institution and to serve as an indicator of the improvements that you've accomplished along the way. So we'll talk a little bit about this in our presentation here today. So when we talk about the adoption of an information security program, thinking about it in terms of a maturity model is a really useful way to start this journey. We're all familiar with assessments, right? We've probably either undergone or participated or have reviewed reports of information security assessments, right? Do you have the control? Yes or no? Here are your findings. But what can really help to drive and help you understand your adoption of compliance to a program is how mature are you with that particular controls implementation, right? Not all controls are created equally. We know there are multiple ways to implement a control, right? So it's not as simple as, is the control in place? Is it not in place, right? There are multiple ways, for example, to design user access management. And some methodologies for user access management are more mature and more effective than others. So we want to talk to you a little bit about the differences between just conducting an assessment of IT or information security and the adoption of a maturity model and framing the assessment in terms of maturity.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to understand the differences between assessment and maturity work and the benefits associated with each one. And based on the introductions, a lot of you have security backgrounds, so you likely understand what a security assessment is or a risk assessment. You have likely conducted these in your institutions. It's important to understand that an assessment is primarily used to assess your security program against a set of controls using an industry framework such as ISO or NIST. However, contrast that with a risk maturity model, which provides a process to help you develop a sustainable, repeatable, and mature enterprise risk management program. Think of this as increasing your capability as you progress through the model. So the way I like to think about this is that assessments are really one and done type of initiatives, where a maturity model is really more of a journey. You're really moving through the model and you're increasing the maturity of your program as you continue to progress through that model. The benefits of completing a risk assessment and using the risk maturity model are highlighted in this table. So if you look at the table, we have 3 rows of activities with columns of the IT risk assessment benefits and risk maturity model. And you can see that a maturity model can provide your organization a greater understanding of your program progress in achieving your desired program maturity goals. And I think that's really important to point out, that while an IT risk assessment is important, it has a very specific purpose in really giving you a baseline of where you stand against a framework. The maturity model really is a way to build a program around the culture of continuous improvement as it relates to security. And that's really key.
So adoption of an information security framework and a maturity model is an ongoing process. And that's what makes this more of a valuable tool than a one-time assessment, or even, obviously assessments can occur on an ongoing basis, right? But they're a point in time data point, right? So looking at that, and assessments have a role in this maturity model and ongoing cycle, right? But they're only one piece of the puzzle. So initially, this is kind of the ongoing process of leveraging a maturity model. You start with conducting some visioning work, thinking about where you want to be with your information security ultimately. And then yes, you conduct an initial assessment, right, with whatever framework that you're using. But with the information learned, you start to implement initiatives to advance the priorities that you've identified, right? Where you want to be, compare and contrast that with where you are, and identify what are those priority areas, those gaps that you should be making progress on. So you identify those priorities and you start implementing the initiatives. Information security then typically tracks the status and progress being made and continues to present results and progress to leadership on a regular basis. That's really an important part of this, is that leadership of an institution or your organization, it's really important to be involved in this process so they can understand what risk priorities are. So this ongoing cycle does call for conducting an assessment of progress periodically. And it makes sense to continue to do something like that, like at the start of each fiscal year, in order to have a good roadmap and establish priorities and specific actions that you can take to advance maturity for each fiscal year. So one framework for IS maturity is a tool that's based on ISO 27000. I'm sure, several of you on this call with your security backgrounds are familiar with this widely accepted and mature information security framework. But there's a tool that is supported by EDUCAUSE with questions that were specifically designed for higher education institutions. And this is a framework that higher ed institutions are starting to adopt. It's comprehensive. It covers 15 security domain areas of focus and is comprised of 101 specific controls that are evaluated as part of the assessment. So I know that, many institutions consider and adopt other frameworks such as NIST, 800, 171, CIS 20 controls, cybersecurity framework. They all cover and map to the domain similar to what's listed here and map to this HISC tool that's been developed by EDUCAUSE.
Great, thank you, Tina. So this takes us to our first polling question. And if you just give me a moment, I will post our first poll question. And we'll give everyone a minute to answer this question. And the question is your institutional organization using an information security framework? And if so, which one? And we have set this up as multiple choice in the event that you're using more than one. So we'll give you a minute to complete the survey question, and we'll share the results. So let me know if you can see the sharing. Am I sharing the results, Tina? Do you see the? Okay. So looks like we have one person indicated NIST 853, one person CIS controls, 2 other, and 2 none. I'm curious about the other. So for the 2 individuals that that selected other, if you don't mind unmuting and sharing which framework you use, that would be, I think, of interest.
Or feel free to use chat if you're more comfortable chatting. Yeah, I know one not listed here, Joe, is the NIST cybersecurity framework as well.
That's true.
But yeah, it's not uncommon for, institutions to really, adopt maybe even a mix, right, of what's generally out there, or kind of, not necessarily be ready to formally adopt a framework. So that's helpful to hear, and maybe some of what we learned today about the framework that we're talking about may be helpful to you.
Absolutely. And I think it's another trend that we're seeing is institutions that are going after research grants, typically have to follow one of the NIST frameworks. If it's federal grant dollars or research dollars, the 853 is a requirement in some cases. We're seeing more of that. That's it's a very big framework, and certainly covers a lot in the different controls that are in that framework. But certainly the 171 is a popular one for other types of compliance, such as GLBA. We're seeing the use of the 171 in those cases across higher ed. So, okay. Let's move on to our next slide. So one of the questions we get is where do I fall within the maturity scale? And we'll have a polling question to give you an opportunity to weigh in on where you think you fit in. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the maturity scale and what it means. So I think it's important to really understand the different levels, what it means, and the implications of each of the levels. So when we build the maturity model using the ISO framework as an example, think of each of the 15 maturity domains of that framework comprising that standard will be ranked on the maturity scale of 0 to 5. And it's important because not all controls are created equal. You may have a password requirement to log onto your computer, but how complex is the password requirement? How often must it be changed? Are systems designed to require multi-factor authentication? This is where we're looking at maturity and its importance for information security. It's something that a lot of institutions really haven't started yet, but it's an important component to maturing your organization's maturity as it relates to security. Now, when we talk about maturity, and especially when a quantitative scale is introduced, it can be very easy to want to set your targets to achieving the best score, but it's not about achieving that perfect score. And tongue in cheek, it's not a Yelp review or rating an Uber striving for 5 stars, if you're familiar with that. So I want to take some time to talk a little bit about each of the maturity ratings, what they mean, and why it's more about a tool for measuring progress rather than a 5-star rating scale. So as we look at this, a maturity score of 0 means a control is not performed or is in place. And I will admit that a 0 sounds bad. And in this case, it is bad. We probably don't want to see any zeros. A score of 1 means there's an informal performance of the control and the practice is not formally adopted across the organization. A score of 2 means that a control has been planned, is implemented, and is repeatable by the organization's members. This sounds pretty good, right? So as we continue to move to the right, a score of 3 means the control is a little bit more well-defined, controls are more mature, robust, and implemented organization-wide. The difference between a 2 and a 3 might mean a new hire checklist is used consistently for every new hire at a 2, but at a 3, the new hire checklist includes more details and involves stakeholders across multiple departments in setting up controls for new hires, as an example. A score of 4 means a control is controlled quantitatively, it is measured and is verified. And a score of 5 means the control is continuously being improved, regularly reviewed, dynamic, and being updated regularly. The gray graph in the background shows that it takes time, resources, and financial costs to develop the maturity of an organization, and that there's a considerable increase in the cost the further you go up the maturity scale. So as you move from left to right, you can see that the gray background depicts the increase in time, resources, and financial cost. Not all controls are created equal or have as much impact on the organization, and it may not make sense for an organization to invest the cost to have quantitatively controlled or continuously improving controls across each of the controls in this framework. In this case, there are 101 controls in the ISO framework. Having most of your controls planned or well-defined may be sufficient, a 2 or a 3 on this scale, for example, with a few key controls that are particular importance be quantitatively controlled in the 4 range or continuously improving in the 5 range. So just keep that in mind that, you know, you don't have to have a score of 4 across all of your controls, that you may decide as an organization that having a level 2 for the majority of your controls is acceptable, and possibly having a higher level for other controls that are deemed more important or more critical to the organization will likely have you know, a different focus level target. So I realize that this is a new way of looking at information security, and typically it's about a yes or a no when you're conducting assessment work. It's either implemented or it's not implemented, and I'm speaking about controls. But truly, to advance your information security practices, a framework like this provides the structure to help institutions continue to make progress and mature their approach to information security. That's what's important about this. It's not about good or bad. It's about the journey of making progress and to be able to track that progress. So I think the key takeaway here is really seeing where you are today with respect to this maturity scale. It allows your institution to make an informed decision about where the most important areas are for investing time and resources to add value and strengthen your information security program. So this takes us to our second polling question. And I will share the poll. Okay, polling question 2. Where do you feel your institution or organization's information security program is in its current maturity? It's a multiple choice in the event that you feel you're in between a level 1 or a level 2, for example. We'll give you a minute to complete the polling question. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results.
Wow, some 5s and 4s. That's very impressive. I guess thinking about those that, you know, my gut was telling me that we might have more in the 2 or the 3 range. I see 2 was kind of the biggest poll selection, but I'm curious for those that are kind of on the higher end of the scale, or is it a couple key particular controls that you feel are really pushing you toward that 4 or 5? Anyone want to share?
Feel free to use the chat.
Chat, or you can unmute yourself and jump right in.
For UB, we do have a lot of security controls in place, and they are honestly really good. I would have probably scored myself higher if we had the budget to kind of upgrade some of our antiquated systems, but I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. But we do have a lot of security controls in place that was honestly surprised when I first started working there.
Nice. And where did you rank UB on the scale?
Between 4 and 5.
4 and 5. Okay. Others want to share their thoughts on their selection for their choice? Okay, great.
Okay.
I can Joe is going to share with us a little bit of, some high level benchmarking data that might help you get a sense of where some other industries are on the scale.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. A common question is always where do we stack up? Where do we fall within this scale? And we wanted to share some context of where some other industries land with the maturity of their information security programs. Industries like retail manufacturing typically have informal or planned controls, and utilities may have a slightly higher maturity of their controls. So we see them falling between a 1 and a 2. Financial services can be a bit more mature with respect to information security, have more well-defined security controls. We also found that typically higher education generally does not score as high as some more regulated and compliance-driven industries like financial institutions. So they typically fall in the 2 to 3 range, but more towards the 2.
Yeah, and I think, that also depends on the size of the institution, right? The larger an institution, the larger it is to have that same implemented, controlled, well-defined process operating the exact same way across an institution.
Yes, absolutely. And I think budgets play into this as well. And then lastly, other industries like insurance and technology are more advanced. They may operate with controls that are more quantitatively controlled and continuous improving. So we see them in between the 3 and the 5 level on the scale. So that's where we see other industries falling on this scale. So we want to pause here and ask if there are any questions on the framework or any information that we've presented to this point. So we'll just pause for a moment to see if there's any questions. Feel free to use the chat or unmute and jump right in. And just give everyone a few minutes.
The characteristics of the measurement seem kind of clear. I'm not sure yet I have an example of what does life actually really look like at 1 or 2 or 3.
Sure. And I think we're planning on showing some examples next of how we kind of put this scale together with those 15 security domains. And in that slide, Rob, I'll spend a little bit of time and kind of talk about some of the differences in our example.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for us at this point? Okay. Joe, we'll keep on keeping on. So this is a sample graph, and it really kind of takes that maturity scale that Joe just showed us of 0 to 5, and it shows the scores of a sample institution of an assessment that we recently conducted of that framework that's based on ISO, right, with those 15 information security domains. And looking at these domains here across the bottom: risk management, policies, asset management, access control. These are all common to any information security framework, right? It's just, it has the ISO identifiers listed, but, these are largely, part of any information security framework that you adopt. So this shows kind of the scores of this institution and where they landed, having undergone the assessment of us ranking their maturity across 101 controls that fall across these 15 domains. And you'll see here that 4 key areas kind of emerged as priorities for them: risk management, policies, supplier relationships, and business continuity. You'll see kind of with the exception of risk management, I'll talk about that in a moment, but with policies, supplier relationships, and business continuity, when looking at this graph, the institution saw that those were really kind of well below what their institutional average was, right? They were largely kind of in the 2.5 range for maturity, but these particular areas were far less mature than others. So they understood that this is where they wanted to make their progress and set their sights to really kind of bring everything up to that more average level. And then the reason that they also selected risk management as a priority area, even though it doesn't necessarily fall that far off the mark for their average of the other domains, is that, this institution really understood that risk management is the basis for all decision making and wanted this to be a bit more mature. So some of the differences here, and I know everyone is typically like, what's a 1, what's a 2, what's a 3 look like? And kind of the progression of maturity for any policy, for any control, it starts with kind of policies, right? And more often than not, we see organizations have controls that are implemented, but largely don't always have the policy, the procedure documented to really support that. And that's kind of the big difference between a 2 or a 3, right? Thinking about the scale that Joe shared with us, a 2 is that it's planned, right? A 1 is that it's performed informally, but a 3 is well-defined. So without having a policy or procedure to support something, you really can't get into that well-defined level. And you see here across the board, this particular institution, they were lacking in their IS policies, right? They scored at a 1.3 there. And that's really what's holding back their overall scores across the board in a number of these areas. Yes, they didn't have any zeros, right? So this institution had controls in every single domain. But because they didn't have definition of policies and procedures and really defining what the expectations for users and employees and information security staff, they couldn't really get to that next tier of maturity to a level 3. So that's why the information security policies was a priority. That really had a trickle effect to all the other domains. Certain things like business continuity, that's something big that was lacking was the actual formal business continuity plan. Obviously, everyone felt that they exercised business continuity in some way in this past year and maybe had some procedures that were tested as a result of COVID-19, but they were still lacking in a formal plan development. Some of the things that were missing in supplier relationships were that it was really an informal process for vendor management that they had in place. And they really weren't taking the time to check in with vendors on a periodic basis and to explicitly state in contracts what those expectations were. So I don't know, Rob, if that helps a little bit to color in the picture of, what it takes to move with progression on this slide, right? You need to first start by defining something, you implement it, but then is everyone doing it consistently, right? That's how you get to a 3. And then overall, is management monitoring the control, right? Are you able to see its effectiveness? That gets you into the 4 of our maturity scale.
Thanks, Tina.
Great. So taking the results of their maturity assessment and maturity scores that we saw on the prior slide, the institution developed their priority areas for their fiscal year. And first and foremost, it was to formalize their information security policies. Joe, if you want to just go to the previous slide real quick.
Sorry, Tina.
The second was to address security controls and supplier relationships. This was the second priority for them because this was obviously the score and domain that they scored the lowest in, but also, hearing of things that had happened with Blackbaud in the past year and breaches that were constantly taking place with vendors, and knowing that they were moving more towards a cloud and a hosted environment. This increasingly became a red flag for them and something that they wanted to make a priority. Formalizing their risk management activities. They acknowledged that this was kind of the foundation for a lot of decisions that they were making. And then fourth was to establish a formal business continuity plan. So on to the next slide, Joe. Wanted to share just a couple samples of these priority items, right? They identified their priority areas, but what the institution then did was further break down each of these priority areas to specific action plans, with specific steps and target dates for completion that would show progress and move these initiatives along. So, for example, for information security policies, they set target dates for each of these to take them over the course of their next fiscal year, develop and implement new policies and procedures, update and refine existing, establish an annual review and approval process, and then to communicate and train staff on an annual basis on those policies and procedures. For their supplier relationships, so essentially vendor management, their key action steps for the fiscal year were to initially review contracts and to establish a plan in order to update security requirements in those contracts to really make explicit to vendors what their expectations were for how they would handle their data. To establish a process for monitoring and reviewing those vendor security controls, right? So the first step is, what are we requiring in the contract? And then the second is, let's make sure that the vendor is doing what we expect. To establish the security requirements for new contracts that should be in place. And then finally, to complete a comprehensive security review for all of their vendors in accordance to the risk rating and the methodology that they've determined fits their institution best. So these are just kind of a couple slides that show how you move from those maturity scores, right, the 1 through 5, into then developing what your priority areas are, and then to specific action items and target dates to help move those priorities and initiatives along in the coming year. So overall, the maturity model for information security is about adopting this program to help establish both those short-term priorities and action plans, but it also is designed to support those longer-term strategies of institutions, and those really go hand in hand. And I know, Joe, you've got a few thoughts to add on this slide as well.
Yes, one of the longer-term strategies is building a culture of continuous improvement and building a repeatable process to support this. This requires engaging stakeholder groups across the institution or organization in conversations regarding the benefits of a risk maturity model, where you want to be as an institution, and identifying the required resources, and eventually elevating the understanding and the adoption of this program. It's about building an ongoing framework that is a long-term versus a one-and-done assessment approach. And keep in mind, this is an organizational initiative, not necessarily just an IT project. It requires all stakeholder groups to be engaged as a team to understand the implications of implementing a maturity model such as this. And it requires everybody to be engaged and involved. And Tina talked about the governance piece of that. And as all of you likely know, the areas within an institution all have some piece of the bigger security, picture across the organization, and everybody has a role to play. And that's why it's important, really, that this is more of an organizational initiative versus an IT initiative. In conclusion, we encourage you to think about what we've presented here today and consider developing a strategic journey of risk maturity at your institution. The long-term benefits of developing a culture of continuous improvement with respect to info security will help advance your security posture and mature your information security practices. This will help support a repeatable and sustainable enterprise risk management program. So this is the end of our planned presentation, and we'd like to hear from you how this resonates and what questions you have regarding anything we have presented today. So feel free, don't be shy. You can use the chat feature, or you can unmute and ask any questions that you may have, and also share with us, how this resonates. Is this something that you feel is an initiative that you would like to start at your institution, or maybe you have started down this path, but we'd like to hear what your experience has been. So with that, feel free to chat or unmute and share your perspective.
Well, great. And, Joe, I'll share that, the institutions that we've undertaken this with, the quantitative scale and the ability to track progress from year to year has been something that's been really valuable, right? Sometimes it takes time to implement things fully, right? And it's hard to check off that box for some of those larger projects and initiatives in information security that sometimes boards and committees are expecting to see checked. But something like a maturity scale can see incremental progress, right, for some of those longer initiatives. And, you know, it's really valuable to be able to show and track that, hey, I moved from a 2 to a 3 for this particular area, or even a 2 to a 2.5. So introducing that aspect of being able to measure progress and to be able to report on that to stakeholders outside of information security teams has been very powerful to a lot of institutions. Well, great. Well, we thank you for your time here this morning. If you have any questions, I know Joe, we can put up our contact information on the next slide. You can feel free to contact Joe and I, and Pat and Tamara, thank you very much for the time here today.
So thank you so much.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to our next MEEC webinar.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.